Dakota Territory, 1880. At 2 in the morning, the thermometer outside most prairie cabins reads 32 degrees below zero. Inside, cast iron stoves sit cold and dark, their fires dead for hours. But in Lars Nilsson's cabin, something different keeps the bitter cold at bay. At the foot of his bed, a heavy iron bucket wrapped in flannel radiates steady warmth through the quilts. Neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool for heating 30 pounds of river sand on his stove all day, then wrapping it like a newborn and sliding it under the bed covers each night. Every other settler trusted the frontier wisdom: bank your fire with a big log and pray it lasts until dawn. Lars spent his fuel heating sand instead of air. Storing the day's fire in a bucket everyone said was pointless. Then the hard winter hit without warning. Temperatures plunged to 40 below and stayed there for weeks. Standard stoves failed families across the territory. Children woke with numb toes. Fathers burned cord after cord trying to keep rooms barely above freezing. But that fool's bucket? It kept feet warm for 8 hours after the fire died, using nothing but sand, iron, and the heat Lars had captured from yesterday's cooking. What did he understand about storing and releasing warmth that everyone else missed? And how did his excessive preparation become the difference between sleeping through the coldest nights and waking every few hours to relight a dying stove? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The cast iron thermometer nailed to the north wall of Lars Nilsson's cabin read 32 degrees below zero at 2 in the morning. But inside, the Norwegian immigrant sat quietly beside his cold stove, wrapping a heavy iron bucket in layers of flannel. His neighbors would have called him mad, heating sand instead of keeping the fire alive. But Lars had learned something in the lumber camps of New England that most prairie settlers never discovered. Heat could be stored, captured like water in a barrel, then released slowly through the longest, coldest hours when every other cabin on the northern plains turned into an icebox. The bucket itself was nothing special, just a 10-inch diameter iron pail he'd bought from Jacob Mercer's general store for 75 cents, money that could have purchased 50 pounds of flour. Inside, 30 pounds of clean river sand radiated warmth that would have been lost up the chimney in any other cabin. Lars had spent the entire day positioning that bucket on top of his stove, stirring the sand with an iron rod, while Ingeborg cooked their meals and heated wash water. By evening, the sand at the center reached temperatures hot enough to burn bare skin, somewhere near 200 degrees, storing more heat than most settlers realized was possible in such a simple container. This wasn't some wild experiment dreamed up on the prairie. Ingeborg remembered her grandmother's stone-heated sleeping benches in the old country, massive masonry structures that absorbed heat from cooking fires and kept Norwegian farmhouses warm through subarctic nights. In New England, Lars had seen Yankee housewives using brass warming pans filled with hot sand or soapstone bed warmers that wealthy families heated by the fire and slipped between their sheets. The principle was always the same: capture the day's heat in something dense enough to hold it, then coast on that stored warmth when fuel ran short. But frontier neighbors saw only waste and foolishness. Eli McCrae, the settlement's blacksmith, had laughed openly when he watched Lars positioning his bucket on the stove. "You're heating sand while your cabin stays cold," McCrae had said, gesturing at the iron pail taking up valuable stove space. "Put another log on the fire like a sensible man. That's what stoves are for." The blacksmith trusted his cast iron logic. Keep the firebox roaring hot, bank it with the biggest log you could find, and hope it lasted until dawn. Most families followed the same routine, burning 40 or 50 pounds of hardwood each night, then waking in the early hours to relight cold stoves when the temperature inside their cabins dropped toward freezing. Even Horace Kendall, the former Union officer who worked as a land agent, had dismissed the sand bucket when he passed through the settlement in late summer. Kendall carried pamphlets from stove manufacturers back east, printed advice that praised modern cast iron heating and warned against primitive methods that belonged to an earlier age. Heat is heat, Kendall had told a gathering of homesteaders. A good iron stove burns clean and throws plenty of warmth. You don't need peasant tricks with buckets and sand when you have proper American engineering. The land agent spoke with the confidence of a man who'd spent his winters in heated barracks and hotel rooms, not in single-wall log cabins where the inside temperature followed the weather like a faithful dog. What those critics didn't understand was the simple physics that Ingeborg had learned from practical necessity and Lars had observed in lumber camp bunkhouses. Cast iron heated fast but cooled just as quickly, throwing fierce heat while the fire burned but offering nothing once the coals died. Sand, packed dense in a heavy container, could absorb nearly twice as much heat per pound and release it slowly over hours. The same principle that made soapstone stoves so prized in Vermont, their ability to stay warm long after the fire died, worked just as well with river sand and an iron bucket if you had the patience to heat it properly and the sense to wrap it against heat loss. The nightly routine had become second nature by October. While other families scrambled to bank their fires with green logs that smoked and barely burned, Lars and Ingeborg simply lifted their hot sand bucket with heavy mittens, set it on a wooden board to protect the floor, and wrapped it in 2 layers of flannel plus a wool blanket. The bundle went under their bed covers at the foot, creating a zone of steady warmth that would last 8 hours without tending, without smoke, without the risk of embers setting bedding ablaze. Their feet and lower legs stayed comfortable even when the cabin air dropped to 40 degrees, and they never had to leave their bed to restart a dying fire in the middle of the night. By November, when the first serious cold snap hit the territory, the difference became impossible to ignore. Anders Johansson, the Swedish farmer on the neighboring quarter section, burned through 2 armloads of wood every night trying to keep his standard 16 by 18-foot cabin above freezing. His children woke shivering at 3 in the morning, and Anders stumbled from bed to reload his iron stove with another 20 pounds of split wood, a routine that consumed an extra half-quart of fuel each month. Meanwhile, Lars and Ingeborg slept through the coldest nights using only the heat they'd captured during the day, their sand battery bleeding warmth at exactly the rate needed to keep their feet above 60 degrees until dawn. Mary Collins, who'd grown up seeing brass warming pans in New England mill towns, watched the winter pattern with growing interest. She'd heard women back east praise soapstone foot warmers for their ability to hold the night's comfort in a single heating, and she began to understand that Lars hadn't invented anything new. He'd simply applied old knowledge using frontier materials. When December brought the first sustained cold wave, with daytime highs staying below 0 for a week straight, Mary quietly asked Ingeborg for instruction in the sand wrapping technique. Within days, the Collins family had their own hot sand battery warming their bed, and Mary's youngest daughter stopped waking with cramped, cold feet that had plagued her through previous winters. The mockery continued, but it carried less conviction as the season deepened. Jacob Mercer, who ran the general store, noticed that families using the sand method weren't buying as much lamp oil for middle-of-the-night heating, and they seemed to stretch their firewood supplies further than households that relied purely on overnight banking. Even Eli McRae, stubborn as prairie sod, had begun asking indirect questions about sand drying and bucket sizes, though he still insisted publicly that good iron and plenty of wood remained the proper frontier approach to winter heating. The first week of December brought the kind of cold that separated seasoned homesteaders from those who wouldn't see spring. Temperatures dropped to 15 below 0 and stayed there, with northwest winds driving the chill through every gap in log cabin walls. Snow piled 3 feet deep against the north sides of buildings, and ice formed thick enough on Chansol window panes that families couldn't see outside even at midday. This was the weather that tested every heating strategy on the northern plains, revealing which methods could sustain human life through months of subarctic conditions and which would fail when survival depended on staying warm with limited fuel. Most families followed the accepted wisdom for deep cold nights. They fed their cast iron stoves continuously until bedtime, burning 3 or 4 split logs every hour to keep cabin temperatures around 60 degrees near the firebox. The evening ritual involved cramming the largest available log into the stove's firebox, damping the air intake to slow the burn, and hoping that banking technique would maintain some heat until dawn. In a typical 16 by 18-foot cabin with 7 log-high walls and clay chinking, the strategy worked for perhaps 2 hours after the last feeding. By midnight, interior temperatures dropped to the mid-40s. By 3 in the morning, thermometers showed readings in the 30s, and sleeping families could see their breath in the darkness. Anders Johansson discovered the limitations of conventional heating during a particularly brutal night in mid-December. He'd followed his usual routine, loading his iron stove with a massive oak log at 10 o'clock and adjusting the damper to create what he hoped would be a slow, steady burn lasting until sunrise. The stove radiated fierce heat for the first hour, warming his cabin to nearly 70 degrees near the firebox, though the sleeping corner where his children's bed sat remained 20 degrees cooler. By 2 in the morning, Anders woke to the sound of his youngest daughter crying. The banking log had burned through, the stove sat cold, and the cabin temperature had plummeted to 28 degrees, cold enough that water left in a cup near the window had developed a skin of ice. Anders stumbled from bed, his feet hitting floorboards so cold they felt like stepping on iron, and spent 20 minutes rekindling his fire with dry kindling and another armload of split wood. The process consumed 15 pounds of fuel just to restore basic warmth, and his family shivered under quilts for another hour, while the cabin slowly climbed back toward livable temperatures. This emergency heating routine would repeat itself 3 more times before spring, each incident burning an extra day's worth of wood and leaving everyone exhausted from broken sleep. By season's end, families using this banking and restart method consumed 12 to 15 cords of hardwood, with nearly a quarter of that fuel going to middle-of-the-night emergency heating when standard techniques failed. The problem lay in cast iron's fundamental thermal properties, though few frontier families understood the physics involved. Cast iron heated quickly when exposed to flame, reaching temperatures that could glow red-hot within minutes, but it also cooled rapidly once the fire died. A typical small stove might weigh 150 pounds, but its thin walls and hollow interior meant it could store only limited heat compared to its weight. More critically, much of the heat generated during burning escaped immediately up the chimney, wasted as hot gases that carried thermal energy away from the cabin instead of storing it for later use. The banking technique worked only as long as wood remained in the firebox to generate new heat, and even the largest log rarely lasted more than 3 hours in the dry air and efficient draft of a well-designed stove. Mary Collins, who'd grown up in New England mill towns, recognized the problem from her childhood observations of different heating methods. Wealthy families in her hometown had used soapstone stoves that weighed twice as much as iron models and cost considerably more, but they stayed warm for hours after the fire died. The quarried stone absorbed heat slowly during burning, then released it gradually through the night, providing steady warmth without constant tending. Soapstone bed warmers worked on the same principle, dense material that could soak up heat from the fire and hold it long enough to keep feet warm through 8 hours of sleep. What Lars had done with his sand bucket was simply frontier improvisation, using the same thermal mass approach that New England manufacturers had been selling as premium heating equipment since the 1840s. The contrast became stark during a 3-day cold snap in late December, when temperatures never rose above 10 below zero, even at midday. Eli McCrae, still committed to his cast iron and firewood approach, burned through nearly a full cord of wood in 72 hours, feeding his stove every few hours around the clock and still waking to a frigid cabin each morning. His wife wrapped heated bricks in towels and placed them in the children's beds. But the bricks cooled within an hour and provided little comfort through the coldest pre-dawn hours. McCrae's stove threw plenty of heat while burning, but it offered nothing during the crucial period between midnight and sunrise, when outdoor temperatures reached their lowest point and human bodies needed warmth most desperately. Meanwhile, Lars and Ingeborg maintained their sand battery routine with minor adjustments for the extreme conditions. They heated 2 buckets instead of 1, rotating them on the stove throughout the day to ensure both reached maximum temperature by evening. The larger thermal mass meant their bed stayed comfortable even when cabin air dropped to 35 degrees, and they never needed emergency heating during the night. Their wood consumption remained steady at normal levels, perhaps 30 pounds per day for cooking and daytime heating, while neighbors burned nearly twice that amount struggling to maintain basic warmth through conventional methods. The difference represented more than convenience. It was the margin between sustainable heating and gradually exhausting fuel supplies that families had spent months cutting and hauling. Thomas White Elk, who occasionally traded at Mercer's store, observed the settlement's heating struggles with the patience of someone whose people had survived Great Plains winters for generations. He'd grown up in earth lodges where heated stones provided warmth through the coldest nights, and he understood that surviving extreme weather required working with thermal mass rather than fighting it with continuous burning. Native communities had long used the principle Lars had discovered: capture heat in dense materials during the day, then release it slowly when fuel became scarce or dangerous to tend. The practice wasn't limited to plains tribes. Arctic peoples used heated stones and controlled airflow to maintain livable temperatures in snow houses, and southwestern communities built thick adobe walls that absorbed solar heat and released it through cold desert nights. By January, even the most stubborn critics began paying attention to the families who slept through cold snaps without emergency heating. Jacob Mercer noted increased sales of heavy iron buckets and flat-bottomed kettles, and he quietly began stocking merchandise better suited to sand heating than his previous inventory of lightweight cookware. The mockery continued in public conversations, but private inquiries about bucket sizes, sand preparation, and wrapping techniques suggested that practical necessity was overcoming social resistance to what neighbors still called the Norwegians' fool trick. When Mary Collins finally approached Ingeborg for detailed instruction in sand heating, she discovered that what appeared to be a simple frontier improvisation actually followed principles that stretched back through generations of cold weather survival knowledge. Ingeborg traced the technique to her grandmother's coastal farmhouse in Norway, where massive stone platforms built into the cooking hearth absorbed heat from daily fires and kept sleeping areas warm through Arctic nights. The concept had traveled to New England with Scandinavian immigrants, evolved through Yankee practicality, and reached the prairie in the form of 30 pounds of river sand and an iron bucket that cost less than $1, but performed the same function as expensive soapstone equipment selling for 10 times that price in Eastern catalogs. The knowledge had deeper roots than European tradition. Thomas White Elk, during one of his trading visits to the settlement, recognized immediately what Lars was attempting when he saw the wrapped bucket beside the Norwegian's bed. Plains tribes had used heated stones for centuries, carrying the technique into earth lodges and winter camps where maintaining warmth without constant fire tending could mean the difference between survival and death during extended blizzards. Cherokee communities in the Appalachian Mountains modified rock overhangs with stone-lined fire pits that captured heat during the day and released it gradually through the night, using thermal mass to extend the warming power of limited fuel. Arctic peoples perfected similar methods, heating stones in outdoor fires, and carrying them into snow shelters where controlled heat release could maintain livable temperatures for 8 to 10 hours without additional burning. The physics underlying these traditional practices remained consistent regardless of culture or materials. Dense substances like stone, sand, or clay could absorb significantly more heat per pound than metals like iron or steel, and they released that stored energy much more slowly. When Lars heated 30 pounds of sand to 200 degrees and wrapped it properly, he created a thermal battery containing roughly 600,000 joules of stored heat energy. Released gradually over 8 hours, that represented a continuous warming output of about 25 watts, focused precisely where human bodies needed it most, at the feet and lower legs where blood circulation was poorest, and cold injury occurred first. Mary Collins understood the practical application, even if she couldn't calculate the precise physics. She'd watched wealthy New England families pay premium prices for soapstone bed warmers that provided exactly the same function, and she'd seen poor families make do with heated bricks wrapped in towels that cooled too quickly to last through the night. Sand offered advantages over both alternatives. It was free for the gathering. It heated more evenly than brick. It held temperature longer than iron, and it posed no fire risk once removed from the stove and properly wrapped. The key lay in preparation and technique, details that Ingeborg shared with the careful precision of someone whose family's comfort depended on getting every step right. Sand collection required patience and planning that most homesteaders hadn't considered. Ingeborg and Lars had spent several summer days gathering clean river sand from bars along the nearest creek, selecting material free from clay, organic matter, and stones that could crack when heated. They'd hauled 4 bushels back to their cabin in late July, then spread the sand on boards in their loft where it could dry completely over 6 weeks of prairie heat. Wet sand could explode when heated rapidly, and even slightly damp material would create steam that made wrapping dangerous and ineffective. The drying process meant thinking about winter heating strategies during harvest season, when most families focused on grain cutting and food preservation rather than fuel preparation. The bucket itself demanded specific characteristics that Jacob Mercer had initially failed to stock adequately. Lightweight tin pails buckled under the thermal stress of daily heating cycles, and their thin walls conducted heat too rapidly for effective storage. Heavy iron buckets with thick walls and flat bottoms proved most suitable, though they cost nearly 3 times as much as standard farm pails. The ideal size balanced storage capacity against handling weight, a 10-inch diameter bucket could hold 30 pounds of sand while remaining manageable for lifting with heavy mittens. But larger containers became dangerously awkward when heated to 200 degrees and required 2 people to move safely. Daily operation followed a routine that Ingeborg had refined through weeks of experimentation. The sand bucket occupied the center of the stovetop from morning until evening, positioned where it would receive maximum heat without interfering with cooking activities. Every few hours, she stirred the contents with an iron rod to prevent hot spots and ensure even heating throughout the mass. By late afternoon, the sand at the center reached temperatures that would burn exposed skin instantly, though the bucket's iron walls remained handleable with thick mittens. Testing for proper heat involved holding the back of her hand a few inches from the wrapped bundle. If she couldn't maintain that position for 5 seconds, the sand needed more cooling time before it could be safely placed in bedding. The wrapping technique proved as crucial as the heating process. Ingeborg used 2 layers of old flannel sheeting, each piece large enough to envelop the bucket completely with several inches of overlap. Over this went a wool blanket folded double, creating insulation thick enough to throttle heat release down to safe, comfortable levels while preventing any direct contact between hot iron and bedding materials. The wrapped bundle resembled an oversized pillow that radiated gentle warmth through heavy quilts, and it could be repositioned during the night to provide heat wherever it was needed most without unwrapping or reheating. Safety considerations that Ingeborg emphasized reflected hard-learned lessons from generations of women who'd managed heating in wooden houses filled with flammable materials. The bucket never traveled directly from stove to bed. It always rested on a wooden board for 10 to 15 minutes, while she tested the wrapping temperature and ensured no hot spots could ignite fabric. Multiple layers of insulation prevented burns, even if someone rolled against the bundle during sleep, and the thermal mass was large enough that it cooled gradually rather than creating dangerous temperature spikes that could sear skin or bedding. When Anders Johansson finally swallowed his pride and asked for instruction after his children suffered through another night of frozen feet, he discovered that copying the technique required more skill and attention than he'd expected. His first attempt used damp sand that hissed and steamed when heated, creating moisture that made proper wrapping impossible. His second try involved a lightweight bucket that warped from thermal stress and developed leaks that made it useless for holding sand. Only after following Ingeborg's precise instructions for material selection, drying, procedures, and wrapping methods did he achieve the steady, all-night warmth that had kept the Nielsen family comfortable while their neighbors shivered through the coldest weather in memory. The night of January 15th brought the kind of cold that frontier families would remember for decades. The thermometer outside Eli McRae's blacksmith shop registered 42 degrees below zero at midnight, with northwest winds driving the chill factor even lower. Snow had been falling steadily for 18 hours, adding another foot to drifts that already reached the windowsills of most cabins. This was the weather that separated survival strategies from wishful thinking, the test that would reveal which heating methods could sustain human life and which would fail when the margin for error disappeared entirely. In Anders Johansson's cabin, the Swedish farmer followed his standard routine with desperate intensity. He crammed his cast-iron stove with every piece of seasoned hardwood he could fit, creating a roaring fire that heated his 16 by 18-foot cabin to 70 degrees near the firebox. At 10 o'clock, he loaded the largest oak log he could find into the stove, damped the air intake to slow the burn, and prayed the banking technique would carry his family through until dawn. His children huddled under every quilt and blanket he owned, their breath visible even inside the cabin, while Anders and his wife took turns checking the stove every hour to ensure the fire hadn't died completely. By midnight, the banking log had burned down to coals, and the cabin temperature had dropped to 45 degrees. Anders fed another armload of wood into the firebox, but the bitter outside air was pulling heat from his cabin faster than the iron stove could replace it. At 2 a.m, his youngest daughter woke crying that she couldn't feel her toes. The cabin thermometer read 31 degrees, and ice was forming on the inside of the single window. Anders stumbled from bed onto floorboards so cold they burned his bare feet and spent 20 minutes coaxing another fire from dying coals and precious dry kindling. The emergency heating consumed 15 pounds of his dwindling wood supply and required another feeding at 4 o'clock when temperatures dropped even further. 3 cabins away, Lars and Ingeborg Nielsen slept undisturbed through the same brutal night. Their iron stove had been cold since 10:30, when Lars allowed the last cooking fire to die down to ash. But at the foot of their bed, 2 sand-filled buckets wrapped in flannel and wool provided steady warmth that would last until sunrise. The thermal mass they'd created, 60 pounds of sand heated to 200 degrees during the day, released heat at exactly the rate needed to keep their feet and lower legs comfortable, even as cabin air dropped toward freezing. Their wood consumption for the entire night was 0 pounds, while neighbors burned 30 to 40 pounds each. in desperate attempts to maintain survivable temperatures. Mary Collins, who had adopted the sand battery method after watching Ingeborg's technique, experienced her first test of the system during the same cold snap. Her family's cabin reached similar low temperatures as their neighbors, but the heated sand bundle at the foot of their bed created a zone of comfort that kept everyone sleeping peacefully. Her youngest daughter, who had suffered through previous winters with chronically cold feet that sometimes went numb, slept warm and undisturbed for 8 straight hours. The Collins family used no emergency heating during the night, and Mary woke to find their sand bundles still radiating gentle heat at dawn, though the cabin air had dropped to 38 degrees. The contrast became impossible to ignore when morning revealed the toll that different heating strategies had taken on frontier families. Anders Johansson emerged from his cabin exhausted from broken sleep and emergency heating sessions, having burned through nearly 2 full days' worth of firewood in a single night. His children were cranky from poor sleep and worried about their father's growing anxiety over fuel supplies that were disappearing faster than he'd planned. Eli McCrae faced similar problems, having consumed 3 armloads of wood during the night, and still waking to a cabin so cold that water in his wash basin had frozen solid. Meanwhile, families using the sand battery method reported their best night's sleep in weeks. The heated sand had provided steady, localized warmth where human bodies needed it most, allowing comfortable rest even when cabin air grew too cold for normal heating methods. Their wood supplies remained intact for cooking and daytime heating, while neighbors who relied purely on overnight burning were consuming fuel at rates that threatened to exhaust their winter supply before spring arrived. The crisis deepened over the following week as temperatures remained below zero even during daytime hours. Families using conventional banking techniques found themselves trapped in a cycle of emergency heating that consumed increasing amounts of firewood while providing decreasing comfort. Children developed chilblains from repeated exposure to near-freezing temperatures, and parents lost sleep from constant worry about maintaining adequate warmth. Some households began burning furniture and fence posts when their cut firewood ran dangerously low, while others sent family members to neighboring towns in search of fuel that was becoming scarce throughout the region. By the end of January, the sand battery users had established a clear advantage in both comfort and fuel efficiency. Their children showed no signs of cold injury, their families slept through the coldest nights without interruption, and their wood supplies remained adequate for the remainder of winter. The thermal mass principle had proved itself under the most demanding conditions. The northern plains could provide storing and releasing heat with an efficiency that cast iron stoves simply couldn't match during extended periods of extreme cold. Word of the technique began spreading beyond the immediate settlement as desperate families searched for heating solutions that didn't require constant fuel consumption. Jacob Mercer noticed increased demand for heavy iron buckets and began quietly advertising them as suitable for heating sand or stones, though he still avoided open endorsement of what many considered an eccentric Norwegian practice. Even Horace Kendall, the former officer who had dismissed thermal mass methods as primitive, asked indirect questions about bucket sizes and sand preparation when he realized that traditional stove and banking techniques were failing families across the territory. The winter of 1880 to 81 would be remembered as one of the harshest in frontier history, but for a small group of families who had learned to store heat in sand and release it slowly through the coldest hours, it became proof that old knowledge adapted to new circumstances could outperform the most modern equipment when survival depended on working with natural principles rather than fighting them. Spring thaw in 1881 revealed the true cost of the hard winter across Dakota Territory. Families who had relied purely on cast iron stoves and overnight banking emerged from the coldest months exhausted and depleted, having burned through wood supplies that should have lasted until April. Anders Johansson calculated that his emergency heating sessions had consumed an extra cord and a half of firewood, representing weeks of additional cutting that he couldn't spare from spring planting preparations. His children had suffered through repeated bouts of chilblains and poor sleep, and his wife showed signs of the chronic fatigue that plagued frontier families who spent months fighting inadequate heating systems. The contrast with sand battery users became undeniable when neighbors tallied their winter fuel consumption and compared notes on family health through the coldest weeks. Mary Collins reported using roughly 30% less firewood than previous winters, despite temperatures that had reached record lows for extended periods. Her children had slept soundly through nights that left other families huddled around dying stoves, and she'd never been forced to burn furniture or fence posts when cut wood ran short. The heated sand method had carried her family through the most demanding winter in memory, while actually reducing their fuel needs and improving their comfort. Eli McRae, whose stubborn commitment to cast iron and firewood techniques had cost him dearly during the cold snaps, finally admitted the obvious during a community gathering in early March. "That Norwegian's bucket kept his young ones warmer than my stove kept mine," he said quietly, addressing a group of homesteaders who were sharing winter survival stories. "I burned near twice the wood I planned, and my children still woke with numb feet more nights than I care to count. Whatever Lars figured out about storing heat, it worked better than anything I tried." The blacksmith's public acknowledgement carried weight throughout the settlement, coming from someone whose expertise with iron and fire had previously made him the most vocal critic of thermal mass methods. Jacob Mercer had watched the winter's lessons unfold through his store sales and customer conversations, noting which families had stretched their supplies successfully and which had struggled with fuel shortages and heating failures. By spring, he was quietly stocking heavier iron buckets and flat-bottomed kettles, advertising them in his simple handbills as suitable for heating sand or stones for bed warming. The merchant avoided direct endorsement of specific techniques, but his inventory changes reflected the practical reality that customers were asking for equipment better suited to thermal mass heating than the lightweight cookware he'd previously carried. The technique began spreading beyond the original settlement through the informal networks that carried frontier knowledge across vast distances. Travelers stopping at way stations heard about the Norwegian sand method from families who'd adopted it, and they carried descriptions of bucket sizes and wrapping techniques to other communities facing similar heating challenges. New homesteaders arriving in the territory were advised by land agents and experienced neighbors to bring extra heavy pails for sand heating, reflecting how quickly the practice had moved from local oddity to standard preparation advice. Commercial manufacturers in established eastern cities had been developing similar products for decades, though most frontier families remained unaware of the connection between their improvised sand batteries and expensive soapstone equipment sold through mail-order catalogs. Vermont Soapstone Company had been marketing bed warmers and foot heaters since the 1840s, advertising their product's ability to absorb heat rapidly and release it gradually through the longest winter nights. Pennsylvania quarries supplied stone stove manufacturers who built heating systems specifically designed to store thermal mass and extend burning efficiency, selling to customers who understood that dense materials could outperform cast iron for sustained warmth. The physics underlying these diverse applications remained consistent whether the thermal mass consisted of quarried soapstone, river sand, or heated fieldstone. Dense materials with high specific heat could absorb and store significantly more energy per pound than metals, and they released that stored heat gradually over hours rather than minutes. A 30-pound sand battery could provide steady warming equivalent to a small continuous fire, but focus precisely where human bodies needed. At most, and without the fuel consumption, smoke production, or fire risk of maintaining actual combustion through the coldest hours. Thomas White Elk, recognized the technique's kinship with traditional native heating methods when he observed how quickly it had been adopted by frontier families who'd initially dismissed indigenous knowledge as primitive. Plains tribes had used heated stones in earth lodges for generations. Arctic peoples had perfected similar thermal mass techniques in snow shelters, and southwestern communities had built entire architectural systems around capturing and releasing solar heat in adobe walls. What Lars had accomplished with his sand bucket represented the same engineering principles that had sustained human settlements in extreme climates long before European colonization brought cast iron stoves to the American frontier. By the winter of 1881 to 82, the sand battery method had become accepted practice among experienced homesteaders throughout the northern plains. Families who'd suffered through the previous year's cold snaps without adequate heating prepared multiple thermal mass systems, rotating sand-filled containers on their stoves, and experimenting with heated stones and brick alternatives. The mockery that had greeted Lars's original efforts gave way to respectful inquiry about bucket sizes, sand preparation, and wrapping techniques that could mean the difference between comfortable sleep and midnight emergencies when temperatures dropped below survival thresholds. The transformation reflected a broader pattern in frontier adaptation, where traditional knowledge from multiple cultures combined with practical necessity to create solutions that worked better than purely modern approaches. European masonry stove techniques, Native American thermal mass methods, New England bed warming practices, and prairie improvisation had merged into a heating strategy that could sustain families through extreme weather using materials and fuel that most homesteaders could obtain locally. What had begun as one Norwegian immigrant's memory of heated sleeping benches had evolved into regional survival knowledge that would influence cold weather heating practices for generations to come, proving that the oldest engineering principles often provided the most reliable solutions when human comfort and survival hung in the balance.